Abridged version of the book Wind and Truth by Brandon Sanderson. In a world plagued by eternal storms and ancient conflicts, the fate of humanity is decided in an epic battle between divine forces and unlikely heroes. In Wind and Truth, the fifth installment of Brandon Sanderson's critically acclaimed Stormlight Archive series, Dalinar challenges the god Odium to a duel of champions that will determine the future of Roshar. With only 10 days to prepare, the Knights Radiant must unite and strengthen their alliances to face the impending confrontation. Meanwhile, Shallan, Renarin, and Relaine investigate the mystery of the unmade Ba-Ado Mishram and its connection to the Singer's enslavement and the deaths of their spren. Simultaneously, Sheth and Kaladin travel to Shinovar to confront the Unmade's dark influence and face their own inner demons. Part 1. The King and the Shadows. The wind howled across the mountains, carrying with it the echoes of ancient storms and whispers of a past that Gavilar longed to understand. High in Alethkar's palace, surrounded by walls adorned with tapestries that told of the glories of his lineage, the king bent over the texts of the Way of Kings, a tome whose words seemed to change meaning in the dim lamplight. There was more than ambition in his eyes. It was a spark of obsession, an insatiable hunger for that which the gods themselves seemed to guard with suspicion. From his study, Gavilar looked out over the world he had conquered. Soldiers marched in formation in the training yards, their footsteps echoing like distant thunder. Beyond, the markets bustled with activity, but to the king, it was all noise, a distraction. My subjects, mere pieces in a game whose board I will design myself, he thought, his gaze returning to the lines in the book. Every night, visions haunted him. 9 honor blades, their blades gleaming and ancient, stuck into the ground like an eternal challenge. The shadows of the heralds danced in his mind, towering figures who had defied death itself. Gavilar believed he understood them. If they could endure millennia of torment, why not I? He murmured, his voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Because you are not ready, the Stormfather's deep voice echoed, filling the room with an almost tangible gravity. Gavilar did not flinch. The presence of that entity had become almost a constant. But his answer was direct, tinged with defiance. That is not for you to decide. The Stormfather was silent for a moment. Then his tone turned stern. The words will not accept you. The truths are not for the arrogant. Gavilar leaped to his feet, his cloak billowing like a storm. And who decides what is arrogance? What right do the heralds, or you, have to deny my destiny? The king held up the book, displaying it as if it were a weapon. The firelight danced across his golden letters. The Stormfather did not respond. His presence faded, leaving Gavilar to echo with his own thoughts. He walked to the window, where the mountains rose like implacable guardians against the night sky. In the distance, storms were beginning to build, their lightning briefly illuminating the broken plains. My legacy will not be dust, Gavilar thought, clenching his fists. What others call arrogance, I call vision. And that vision will carry me beyond death. As the first drop of rain hit the glass, the king returned to his desk, his gaze fixed on the pages of the book. Outside, the winds picked up, as if Roshar itself knew something inevitable was about to happen. Part 2. Warnings on the Wind Knight had fallen upon Alethkar's palace, and the echoes of the court had faded to a distant whisper. Gavilar stood alone in his study, immersed in the cryptic traces of the Way of Kings. The flickering light from the lamps cast shadows that elongated and twisted as if trying to escape the walls. Suddenly, a knock echoed at the door. Before he could respond, it flew open, revealing the imposing figure of Dalinar. Gavilar. His voice boomed as he stepped through the threshold uninvited, his heavy boots leaving muddy marks on the embroidered carpet. Gavilar looked up calm, though his lips twisted slightly in annoyance. Brother, what urgency could justify this lack of courtesy? Dalinar didn't immediately respond. He slammed the door shut, his dark eyes shining with an unusual intensity. The Parshendi are restless, he said finally, his voice low and heavy with tension. "Something moves in the winds." Gavilar sighed. He knew his brother well, a man guided by instinct, by the weight of the sword rather than the precision of words. "Dalinar, the winds always move. It is their nature. But wise men are not swayed by them." Dalinar stepped closer, his footsteps echoing like war drums. "I speak of no ordinary storm, Gavilar. Something is wrong. These meetings with the Parshendi, this treaty you are forcing, I do not like it." His normally impassive eyes held a strange mix of fury and fear. "What are you planning?" "Strategy," Gavilar said, leaning back in his chair. "Carefully woven alliances." Dalinar slammed his fist on the desk. "Do not toy with me, brother. The Parshendi are not like the others. There is something about them. Something ancient, something I do not understand, but also do not trust." Gavilar rose slowly, his height matching Dalinar's. "And that is precisely why we must control them," he said, his tone soft but unyielding. "This treaty is not just a superficial peace. It is the foundation of something greater, something you would not understand." "Tell me, then." Dalinar roared, his words filled with frustration. Gavilar did not respond. His eyes, cold and calculating, spoke more than his words ever could. Dalinar turned in frustration and stalked out of the study, leaving behind a trail of tension that Gavilar chose to ignore. Later that evening, the banquet began with the usual pomp, but something in the air seemed off. Amid the murmur of the guests and the clink of glasses, a man appeared. Thadakar. His black cloak and imposing presence absorbed the light around him. "King Gavilar," he said, his voice low and sharp, like a hidden dagger. "You have played with forces you do not understand." Gavilar narrowed his eyes. "Tell me something I do not know, Thadakar." The man took a step forward, and the shadows seemed to lean toward him. "You will hand over Restairs. Do so, and I will give you the answers you seek. But mark my words, there is no glory in walking into the abyss." Gavilar smiled, a smirk that did not reach his eyes. "The abyss does not concern me, Thadakar. I concern myself with the throne that awaits beyond." Thadakar did not respond. She vanished into the dimness of the hall, leaving Gavilar with an unexpected weight on his chest. Although confident in his destiny, the warning lingered in his mind like a persistent echo. Outside, the winds began to howl, a harbinger of storms to come. Part 3. The Forbidden Quest. The nights in Alethkar had grown colder, but it wasn't the wind that chilled the palace halls. It was the growing, palpable distance between Gavilar and those around him. In his study, the king delved into sacred texts, desperately searching for the words that would transform his destiny. The pages, yellowed and fragile, held secrets that few dared even read. Navani, his wife, watched him from the threshold. The lamplight barely touched her face, but her eyes betrayed a mixture of sadness and fear. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft, almost a whisper that was lost in the crackling of the fire. "What are you seeking, Gavilar?" He didn't look up from the pages, his fingers tracing the lines as if hoping to draw out some hidden meaning from the ancient texts. "Eternity." Navani crossed her arms, seeking comfort in her own embrace. She knew Gavilar had changed, but she hadn't anticipated how much. "And at what cost?" she asked, taking a step toward him. Gavilar finally looked up, his eyes shining with something she didn't recognize. Not ambition, but a burning, almost insane need. "No matter the price, Navani. The world needs an eternal protector." She looked away, her thoughts screaming what her lips dared not say. Does the world need him? Or do you? Meanwhile, the Parshendi, those precarious and enigmatic allies, began to chant. Rumors of their chants reached the ears of the court. It was an ancient language, incomprehensible to most, but its low, repetitive tones conveyed warning and discontent. At a meeting in the great throne room, Gavilar discussed the rising tensions with his generals. "The Parshendi are restless," one of them said, slamming his fist on the table. "Their chants, it's as if they're foretelling something." Gavilar raised a hand, silencing the man. They predict because they fear. They know that what I am building will change the balance of this world. A younger general, clearly nervous, dared to speak. What if their fears are valid, Your Majesty? What if what we plan unleashes something we cannot control? Gavilar stood, imposing. Control is my specialty. Let me worry about that. You make sure the Parshendi understand that this treaty is unbreakable. But outside the hall, far from the palace walls, the Parshendi were already making their own decisions. In the dark tunnels of their secret meetings, one name echoed in their chants: Sheth Sun Valano. That night, as the winds howled, Navani faced him again in his study. I cannot stop you, Gavilar, but I cannot continue to watch you destroy yourself for something so intangible. Gavilar turned to her, his expression hard as granite. Then don't look, Navani. This is bigger than us, bigger than Alethkar. Navani, her heart heavy, turned and walked out of the study, leaving Gavilar alone with his texts and his ambitions. Outside, the winds carried echoes of chants, promises of betrayal, and an omen that few yet understood. Part 4. The Oath Gate and the Price of Fate. The storm roared like a living monster across the shattered plains, its lightning tearing across the sky in explosions of light and sound. Gavilar Kholin stood his ground, his soaked cloak clinging to his body, his face set in determination. His men, sheltered in makeshift tents, murmured among themselves, their voices barely audible over the roar of the wind. The king is losing his mind, one whispered, tightening his grip on the hilt of his sword. He will lead us to ruin, another replied, his tone heavy with resentment and fear. But Gavilar was not listening. He stood on a rock, holding a fragment of the ancient codex he had found. The words inscribed on the scroll were cryptic, but to him they were full of promise. Urithiru, Oathgate, immortality. Everything was within his grasp, if he could just find a way to connect the pieces. That night, as the storm reached its peak, Gavilar fell into a vision. He was no longer a passive observer, but an actor trapped on a stage that seemed on the verge of collapse. The Honor Blades appeared again, shining with blinding intensity, stuck in the ground of a landscape that did not belong to Roshar. And there, in the shadows, the Stormfather's voice rang out like thunder that shook his soul. The words are near. This time, the tone was cold, almost icy, like a father admonishing a wayward son. But they are not for you, Gavilar. Your ambition will bring devastation. It is not immortality you will find, but destruction. Gavilar gritted his teeth, his anger erupting like a flame. Lies. He screamed into the void. I have seen the ways. I know what I must do. The Stormfather was silent for a moment, before whispering with a clarity that cut through the storm. Ambition blinds men. And you, Gavilar, have blinded yourself. When the vision faded, Gavilar found himself back on the shattered plains. The wind still howled, and the raindrops fell like daggers. His hand shook, not from the cold, but from the weight of the Stormfather's words. Yet his resolve did not waver. He could not waver. The next morning, with the first rays of sunlight filtering through the clouds, Gavilar gathered with his entourage. Ready the horses. We move at dawn. One of the generals, a burly man with a scar running across his cheek, stepped forward. Your Majesty, with respect, the men are at their limit. This quest, is it really necessary? Gavilar stared at him, his voice as sharp as a blade. Do you doubt me? What this mission means to Alethkar? The general hesitated before answering. I do not doubt your leadership, my king. But this place, men feel it is cursed. Gavilar laughed, a hollow laugh that did not reach his eyes. The only one cursed here is me, General. But if I succeed, that fate will change. The group set out, heading into the plains with a mixture of fear and resignation. But Gavilar saw only the road ahead. The murmurs of men and the warnings of the Stormfather were like distant echoes in his mind. All that mattered was what lay beyond the Oathgate. Part 5. The banquet of lies, the atmosphere in the palace was vibrant. The banquet in honor of the treaty with the Parshendi was a spectacle of lights, laughter, and music. But beneath the celebratory facade, dark designs were brewing. In a remote corner, Gavilar, Colin, and Restairs argued in low voices, far from prying eyes. "This has gone too far, Gavilar," Restairs insisted, his face pale in the dim lamplight. "Too far," the king replied, his tone sharp as a blade. "We have barely begun." Restairs took a step toward him, his voice heavy with urgency. "Do you know what you are unleashing? The Voidbringers. If they return, it will be the end of everything." Gavilar looked at him with a mixture of contempt and weariness. "The end," he whispered, almost to himself. "Or the beginning." Restairs opened his mouth to respond, but a glance from Gavilar stopped him. "History will not condemn us, because we will be the ones to write it." At that moment, an imperceptible movement in the room caught Restairs' attention. A hooded figure slipped through the shadows, its presence barely perceptible, but charged with a palpable threat. Meanwhile, in the center of the room, Navani watched her husband with a mix of pride and despair. Her smile was a carefully crafted mask, but her thoughts were elsewhere. "This won't end well," she thought as her eyes searched for Dalinar, who was drinking heavily to drown his own unease. Then everything changed. A gasp cut through the music. Heads turned toward the figure that now towered over the room. Sheth Sun Sunvalano, the assassin of white, moved with terrifying calm, his shard blade flashing in the candelabra light. "What does this mean?" Gavilar demanded, rising to his feet, his voice echoing through the room. Sheth did not respond. His movements were fluid, almost unnatural, as he glided among the terrified guests. Navani ran to Gavilar. "Please," she cried, tugging at his arm. "We must go." Gavilar gently pushed her away, his eyes fixed on the assassin. "No, this is something I must face." Seth stopped before the king, his voice low but clear. "You are a threat to this world. The Parshendi have spoken." Gavilar smiled, his face cold and defiant. "They have no idea what I do. I will save them all, even them." The fight was brief, but brutal. Sheth's skill was superhuman, his movements guided by inexorable purpose. Gavilar, though strong and brave, was no match for the assassin of the white. Each blow of the shard blade seemed to echo not only in the air, but in fate itself. As Gavilar fell to the ground, the shard blade piercing his chest, silence fell over the hall. His eyes, still open, sought out Navani, who knelt beside him. In her shaking hand, Gavilar held a sphere that seemed to glow with an unnatural darkness. "Take care of this," he whispered with his dying breath. His voice, barely a whisper, reached Navani alone. "It is the future." And with those words, Gavilar Colin, king of Alethkar, met his end. The laughter and music of the feast were replaced by the echo of a destiny unfolding like a storm on the horizon. Outside, the winds howled, carrying with them the first murmurs of a new era. Part 6. The tension in the hall reached breaking point as Seth Sun Sunvalano, the assassin of the white, lunged at Gavilar with predatory precision. His shard blade, a lethal weapon that seemed to drink light itself, arced through the air with a deadly wire. Gavilar, though surprised, was not a man to back down. With a swift movement, he drew his blade, the steel gleaming like a beacon of defiance in the dark night that loomed over the palace. The first impact echoed through the great hall, a metallic crash that made the goblets on the tables shake. The nobles, paralyzed by terror, backed away to the corners, their pale faces reflecting the flames of the lamps. Sheth moved with an unearthly grace, his strikes precise, as if each move had been rehearsed 1,000 times in the gloom of some dark corner of the world. "For what?" Gavilar growled, his muscles tensing as he blocked a blow that would have pierced his chest. Sheth didn't immediately respond. His eyes, two pools of bottomless sorrow, met the king's. "For the truth," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Gavilar took a step back, his mind struggling to process the answer, but there was no time to think. Sheth spun, his shard blade describing a wide arc that Gavilar barely managed to dodge. The movement left him vulnerable for an instant Sheth did not waste. The assassin's steel pierced the king's defenses, cutting with the precision of an executioner. Gavilar fell to his knees, his breath escaping in a stifled gasp. Blood began to spread across the marble floor, dark and viscous in the flickering torchlight. "This is not the end," Gavilar muttered, his voice barely audible as his strength left him. His shaking hands reached for something in his belt. Sheth stopped, his gaze fixed on the man he had killed. There was a mixture of regret and determination on his face. "It is not the end," he repeated, as if speaking as much to Gavilar as to himself. "But this is necessary." With a final effort, Gavilar raised a small sphere, glowing with an unnatural light. Its surface seemed to contain a dark maelstrom, a fragment of night trapped within. Murmurs rose among the nobles who watched the scene in horror. In his final moments, as darkness enveloped him, Gavilar remembered the Stormfather's words, those he had dismissed as empty warnings. "It is not destiny you pursue, but your damnation." The sphere fell from his hand to the floor, rolling to a stop in a pool of blood. Sheth watched it for a long moment before turning and leaving. The hall fell silent, broken only by the muffled sobs of Navani as she knelt beside her husband's body. In the shadows, conspiracies twisted and turned like snakes, preparing for what would come next. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the echoes of a storm that was far from over. Part 7. Storms to come. The hall was in silent chaos, as if even the screams had run dry. Gavilar Colin's body lay motionless in a pool of blood that reflected the flickering glow of the lamps. Navani, his wife, was kneeling beside him. Her trembling fingers brushed the cold cheek of the man she once loved, as a single tear rolled down his face. In the light, that tear shone like a jewel, pure and heartbreaking in its sadness. In Gavilar's rigid hand, a dark sphere vibrated softly, almost as if it had a life of its own. Navani took it carefully, her skin prickling at the energy, and hid it in the folds of her dress. Dalinar burst into the hall, his entrance marked by heavy, desperate footsteps. The imposing warrior, normally a force of nature, seemed cowed by the weight of what he saw. His eyes scanned the scene. His brother's body, the terrified nobles, Navani still as a statue of grief. "Gavilar," he whispered, his voice breaking as he knelt beside the body. Navani didn't look up. Her voice was a fragile thread. "You're late, Dalinar." The warrior gritted his teeth, his hands clenching into fists. "I should have been here. I should have protected him." Navani looked at him finally, her eyes bright with pain and something else, something Dalinar couldn't immediately identify. He didn't need protecting, Dalinar. He needed to listen, but he never did. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with everything they couldn't say. Unable to bear it any longer, Dalinar rose and turned to the crowd of nobles standing on the sidelines, muttering amongst themselves. "This isn't over," he roared, his voice echoing off the walls of the hall. "I swear on my life that I will understand what has happened here. I will redeem Gavilar's mistakes and protect Elethkar, no matter the cost." His promise was met with a fearful murmur. In that moment, Dalinar was no longer just a general. There was a determination on his face that he had not shown before, a spark of dawning purpose that those present could not ignore. But in the shadows, something else stirred. The words and actions of that night were not limited to the palace. In the far lands of Roshar, echoes of Gavilar's murder rang like thunder. The Parshendi, now aware that they had set in motion an uncontrollable chain of events, began to sing new songs. Her verses spoke of war, and of a past crumbling under the weight of its secrets. Meanwhile, the winds rose with renewed force, carrying with them the promises of darker storms to come. On the horizon, clouds formed in titanic swirls, as if Roshar itself were reacting to what had happened. Navani, still on her knees, closed her eyes, and held the sphere to her chest. What secrets did you keep, Gavilar? What have you left behind for us? The answers would not come that night, but the questions would take root deep, growing like seeds in the fertile soil of chaos. Roshar would never be the same again. Get the book at planetalibro.com.